Okay, so the one big exception to American isolation, and thank God, was the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Just a brief thumbnail sketch about Roosevelt. He's from the East Coast of Dutch ancestry in New York State. If you're ever up near West Point, up the Hudson from Manhattan, about 75 miles, you can tour his estate, High Park. It's really beautiful. It's right on the Hudson. Went to Harvard, actually didn't do so great at Harvard, gentleman C's, that kind of a thing. His cousin was Teddy Roosevelt, distant cousin, the President of the United States at the turn of the century in the 1900s. He married actually Teddy Roosevelt's niece, Eleanor Roosevelt, at the White House. He moves up because of his connections into government during World War One. Really, for 7 years, he's the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, where he learns a lot. He learns about how government works. He was always partial to the Navy. After in the 1920s, he's seen as a rising Democratic star, but then he's struck down with polio. Polio knocks him down, but it doesn't knock him out. By the 1920s, he is late 1920s. He's become governor of New York. And then in 1932, during the Great Depression, he's elected president of the United States. So folks like him, folks like Roosevelt, they're very East Coast centered, they're very European centric. So he had traveled as a kid in Europe. He knew Europe intimately. He knew some of the leading politicians in Europe. And so he's focused more on Europe, although he's aware of what's going on in China. In 1932, and we don't talk about it too much in this course, Japan invades China, and that's really when World War II begins. I teach a course on World War II that focuses on China. But Roosevelt, he always figures the U.S. can handle Japan. He's much more worried about Hitler. He thinks Hitler is the greater threat than Japan. And he does everything he can to maneuver the United States public opinion in favor, when the war starts, of joining England. France was captured by Hitler in 1940. In joining England, standing alone by 1940 against Hitler. But as I said in my previous podcast, public opinion in the U.S. is very, very stubborn, remarkably stubborn, given how things changed after Pearl Harbor. Americans just don't want to get involved in the war in Europe. They're not going to be fooled again. They're going to learn from the past, but they learned the wrong lesson from the past, because who knows if World War I was necessary. That's a big historical argument, or our entry into it was necessary. But clearly, Hitler had to be stopped. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. Well, maybe some people would, but I think the majority of folks today believe that Hitler had to be stopped. And so Roosevelt's keeping an eye on Europe. He's watching with concern as Hitler rearms, as Hitler recaptures the Rhineland, as he moves into Austria, as he moves into Czechoslovakia. And then, of course, Hitler makes alliances with Italy and Japan. And Roosevelt doesn't like what he's seeing, but what happens is his hands are tied by Senator Nye. If you're looking at this on a screen, you can see Senator Nye on what this isolationism. I guess it's an ostrich that has its head in the sand. By the 1930s, you had these investigations, and you had the Nye Commission. Nye was a senator. I think he was from one of the Dakotas, southern North Dakota, very isolationist. And he holds these hearings, and the outcome of these hearings seem to show that big industries such as DuPont is a munitions part of it's a chemical company, but part of what it does is make munitions. But as I said in the previous podcast, the American industrialists had kind of suckered the U.S. into World War I because they had made so many loans to European countries that if England lost, France lost, that they would get paid back. And so this phrase, merchants of death, becomes current at the time, that large chemical and munitions dealers were willing to let American soldiers die in order to get their debts repaid. And this resonated among Americans during the Depression because people were mad at the industry during the Depression. And again, they're just the cynicism. World War I had been fought, but by the mid-1930s, here we go again. It looks like the same thing is happening. That always happened. Folks start fighting each other, and Americans were kind of sick of it. So what happened is that Nye pushes through Congress, and it's not that hard really. It's against Roosevelt's wishes, but Roosevelt has to play his cards close to the chest because he is going against the current public opinion. Roosevelt wants to get involved in the war against Germany much earlier than the U.S. does. But he can't do it because he needs to be elected president. And he will not be elected president if the public knows that he wants to go to war with Germany. So Roosevelt wins in 32, Hitler's not in power yet. He comes back, he's reelected in 36, Hitler is gaining momentum in 36. And then in 1940, Roosevelt decides to run for a third term, unprecedented, and it'll never happen again because the Constitution was changed after Roosevelt died. So Roosevelt has to think about electoral politics. He has to think about controlling the Congress, the Senate, the House. He just can't be too upfront about his desire to get involved in the war against Germany. So the Nye Commission, to go back to Nye, Nye persuades Congress to pass a number of neutrality acts. And what these neutrality acts did was, in effect, they're trying to avoid the mistakes of the previous World War I. Loans to belligerents is someone fighting the war, they became forbidden. Selling arms to belligerents. Also, the U.S. government can't sell arms to belligerents. In 1939, there was a cash and carry law, and it forbade U.S. citizens from traveling on ships owned or operated by belligerents. Remember, the Lusitania was a ship that was sunk, a British ship during the war, and that was one of the turning points, although the U.S. didn't get involved in the war until 2 years later. But again, what's Nye and his cronies are trying to do is they're trying to make sure that the U.S. by law keeps the hands off in Europe. And then basically, there were also laws that were passed that mitigated the munition sales. It allowed folks to buy munitions at belligerents, England and France. And Germany was never going to be. This was all directed at England and France. But they had to pay cash, and they had to carry the weapons on their own boats. Because again, the U.S. doesn't want to get sucked into the war. So loans, for instance, to England and France aren't allowed. So what's happening is right at the point where Hitler is rising in Europe and, capturing Czechoslovakia, Austria, invades Poland in 1939, the U.S. is going in exactly the opposite direction. And you have these very powerful senators tying Roosevelt's hands and really stopping him, or I would say slowing him from helping England and France. And what he does, and we'll talk about it in a little bit, he has to subvert these laws, and he probably actually subverts the Constitution. But that's for another lecture. The big point here is I just want to give you a context for how deep isolation was in the U.S. But let me say it again. On December 6, 1941, probably 80% at least of Americans had zero desire to get involved in the war, in World War II. And then, of course, the next day, Japan is bombed, and then Hitler declares war on us. And then overnight, it's a different ballgame. But the 10 years before that, no,